Okay, here we go. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is the first main Ace Combat game and the final Ace Combat game in order of the timeline. It takes place in 2040, 39 years after the Lighthouse War, which is the war fought in Ace Combat 7, which is the 8th Ace Combat game in the main series and the 17th Ace Combat game. Electrosphere takes place during the Intercorporate War, a war which is later revealed to have never happened due to taking place entirely within a simulation. Ace Combat 04 Shattered Skies, the second main Ace Combat game and the prequel to Ace Combat 3, takes place during the Continental War of 2003, which is seen through the eyes of a small child who befriends Yellow 13, the man who killed his parents, who is the main enemy of the player, Mobius 1, an elite ace pilot who single-handedly turns the tide of the war. The war ends in 2005 after an ISAF victory against a nation known as Erusia on the continent of Usean, not the Federation of Usean, which is actually also known as Central Usean, which is closely allied with Osea, which goes to war with Erusia over a giant elevator in 2019. Ace Combat 05, the Unsung War, is set during the Cold War, which turns hot when a shadow organization known as the Grey Men, consisting of veterans from the Balkan War of Ace Combat 0, the sequel to Ace Combat 05, which is also a prequel and is the 6th Ace Combat game, in which a nation called Belka becomes fascist and promptly declares war on everyone, loses, then nukes itself 7 times. This is why the Grey Men managed to get the Union of Yuktobania to go to war with Osea. Both Osea and Yuktobania win this war at the same time after defeating the Grey Men, who also win because both militaries are severely weakened, meaning that everyone lost, a decisive victory for both sides. In Ace Combat 0, the Balkan War, the prequel to Ace Combat 5, the 6th Ace Combat game, and the first in order of the timeline, which was released before Ace Combat 6, the 9th installment of the series and the 4th game in order of the timeline, which is the 7th Ace Combat game. You play as a legendary pilot known as Cypher, also known as Demon Lord, and is told from the perspective of a documentary made by a man named Brett Thompson. The documentary, produced in 2005, after the Continental War from Ace Combat 04, sees Brett talking to old pilots you shot down and defeat in the game, as well as your old wingman Pixie, who is also known as Larry Folk, who is an anarchist, your best friend, the final boss, and Seth from Goosebumps. After Belka destroys itself in a series of self-genocidal thermonuclear annihilation attacks, the game ends with Ustio, Osea, Sapin, and other countries winning, and the Demon Lord, aka you, aka Buddy, aka Cypher, portrayed either as a war criminal or a really cool guy, depending on how you've played. Later, due to the real-life Ulysses asteroid leaving the orbit of Jupiter several million years before the dawn of man, Osea builds a bunch of giant railguns to blow up the fragments of said asteroid because it, also known as 1994 XF-04, aka Ulysses, has a hollow interior and is also on a collision course with the Earth. In 1999, this happens, and Ulysses breaks up into large fragments in low Earth orbit and is subsequently shot out of the sky by these giant railguns in an event known as Planetfall, where no planets fell, just the kingdom of Erusia, which collapsed due to a refugee crisis. This, of course, happens after the events of Air Combat, the first Ace Combat game, which has you fighting pirates in 1995. Ace Combat 6, Fires of Liberation, the 7th main installment of the series and the 9th Ace Combat game, takes place in 2016, over 17 years after the events of Ace Combat 0, the first game in the timeline, and the 6th Ace Combat game in the main series, which was the 8th installment in the series. I don't know what happens in Ace Combat 6 because I didn't play it. Ace Combat 7, the 8th installment in the main series, the 17th Ace Combat game, the 5th game in the order of the timeline, takes place 39 years before Ace Combat 3, the first main Ace Combat game, and sees the Federation of Osea fighting Erusia on the continent of Usean, controlled by a corporation controlled by the dead spirit of Belka, which is run by combat drones. You play as Trigger, a war criminal who may or may not have killed the former president of Osea, and you fight Erusian drones and a man named Mihai Dumitru Margareta Cornelio Leopold, Blanca, Carol, Aeon, Ignatius, Raphael, Maria, Niketas, A. Shilaji, over a giant space elevator built by Osea in Erusia on the continent of Usean, just a few hundred kilometers away from the Federation of Central Usean. Obviously, Osea wins, because they have giant railguns from that one asteroid incident in 1999, which they use against the enormous airborne AI-controlled aircraft carrier called the Arsenal Bird. Ace Combat 7 also has a separate DLC storyline told from the perspective of a journalist and his AI assistant about a man named Torres, a rogue ex-Usean captain who's gone insane and has an enormous stealth submarine aircraft carrier with a nuclear railgun, which he intends to use to blow up the capital of Osea because he thinks it'll make Usean and Osea sign a peace with each other. Unfortunately, his army of brainwashed fighter pilots and 2 mentally ill siblings can't prevent you from blowing him up and stepping all over his crisp, white sheets with your dirty boots. Finally, we have the next Ace Combat game, currently under development, occasionally referred to but not confirmed as Ace Combat 8, the 18th game and the 9th game in the main series, which may take place during Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere's plot, the first and last game, which never happened. Ace Combat Assault Horizon, the 14th Ace Combat game, does not take place in the Ace Combat series. It's a disgrace upon humanity, abandoning the entire Ace Combat universe in favor of a generic cash-grab Russia vs. USA plot to capitalize on the success of Call of Duty after the mediocre reception of Ace Combat 6. Various efforts have been made by the community and Bandai Namco to erase any remnants of its miserable existence, reasonably so, might I add. The main reason it has become so hated, however, is due to the infamous DFM, Dogfight Mode, mechanic, which reduced the fundamental, vital core gameplay of Ace Combat in itself to a scripted cutscene where you mash the buttons of your controller until the enemy explodes. Ace Combat Assault Horizon Legacy is the 3DS release of Ace Combat Assault Horizon, which is actually a remake of Ace Combat 2, which takes place in 1998, shortly before the Planetfall event, and is actually pretty good. Ace Combat 7, Skies of Deception, not Ace Combat 7, Skies Unknown, is the 10th Ace Combat and the 7th main Ace Combat game, which takes place in 2020, a year after the Lighthouse War, which happens in Ace Combat 7, Skies Unknown, and making it the 8th and 9th Ace Combat game, depending on who you ask. It's also the 10th Ace Combat. Still following? Great, because it has a sequel. Ace Combat 11, Skies of Incursion, the 8th Ace Combat, just like Ace Combat 7, Skies Unknown, which was released 10 years later, is a prequel to Ace Combat 7, Skies of Deception, which is Ace Combat 10. Ace Combat Northern Wings was a mobile game which doesn't exist anymore, which was also a prequel to Ace Combat 7 and Ace Combat 7 as it ranges from 1999, 2 months after Planetfall, to 2016. You play as Grendel 1,